In 1962, a woman named Vera Stubbs in Sheffield made tripe and onions every Monday without fail. She bought the tripe from the tripe dresser on the market on Saturday morning, cleaned it herself, and simmered it in milk with onions and white pepper for 2 hours until the kitchen smelled of nothing else. Her husband ate 2 bowls of it with white bread and called it the best meal of the week. Her daughter refused to touch it. Her granddaughter has never seen it. Number 9 on this list was eaten by every working-class family in Britain and across Northern Europe for a century and is now so completely absent from the modern diet that most people under 50 would not recognize it on a plate. Number 4 was the staple breakfast of the European working class from the end of the First World War through to the late 1970s and has disappeared so thoroughly that food historians treat it as a curiosity. And number 1, the dish at the very top of this list, was not a special occasion food or a poverty food or a regional speciality. It was simply what people ate in enormous quantities for most of the 20th century until prosperity and convenience and the supermarket arrived simultaneously and removed it from the table without a trial. These are 20 European foods that have almost completely disappeared, eaten in the kitchens and at the tables of ordinary British, French, German, and Belgian households between 1945 and 1985, before the modern food industry convinced an entire continent that the food its grandparents had eaten was either dangerous or disgusting. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because the disappearance of these foods is not just a culinary story, it is the story of how a culture loses its memory, one meal at a time. Let us count them down. Number 20, potted meat and bloater paste. Before the refrigerator was standard in European homes, and for many years after it arrived, the potted meat on the pantry shelf was both a preserved food and a luxury. Bloater paste, made from smoked herring ground smooth with butter and seasoning, was spread on thin bread and eaten at tea time. Potted beef, made from shins simmered for hours until it fell apart and pressed into ceramic jars under a seal of clarified butter, was a standard item on the working-class tea table from the Edwardian era through the 1960s. Shippums and Princes made commercial versions that were in every corner shop and every workplace sandwich box from the 1920s onwards. A jar of bloater paste cost 4p in 1955 and provided enough spread for 6 rounds of sandwiches. When refrigeration made fresh fillings possible year-round and the supermarket replaced the corner shop, the potted meat and the bloater paste drifted off the shelf entirely. Number 19, faggots with mushy peas. The faggot, a ball of minced pig offal bound with breadcrumbs and herbs and baked or fried until its caul-fat wrapper crisped, was the flagship convenience food of the British working-class kitchen from the Industrial Revolution through to the late 1970s. In the Black Country South Wales and the West Midlands, faggots were sold hot from the bakers on a Friday evening, wrapped in paper, and carried home to be eaten with mushy peas. A portion of 4 faggots with mushy peas cost between 1 and 2 shillings in the early 1970s, the cheapest hot meal in any British working-class town. When the mechanically recovered meat scare attached a stigma to offal products, and when fast food chains offered alternatives without cultural freight, the faggot retreated to a regional speciality served ironically in gastropubs. Number 18, brawn and head cheese. The pig's head that arrived at the butcher's in the autumn was the raw material for brawn, a pressed terrine of the simmered head meat set in its own gelatine. Sliced cold with vinegar and white bread, brawn was a regular feature of the working-class cold table in Britain, France where it was called fromage de tête, and Germany where it was known as Sülze. When the pig's head disappeared from the butcher's counter, and when the appetite for gelatinous pressed meats declined, the tradition ended in a generation. Number 17, stewed eels and jellied eels. In the East End of London and the coastal communities of the Thames estuary, the eel was the working-class fish of choice for 2 centuries. The eel pie and mash shop with its green-tiled walls and marble counters served stewed eels in parsley liquor with mashed potato for a few pence from the 1860s through to the 1980s. Jellied eels, the cold version sold from stalls outside pubs and at street markets, were eaten standing up at any hour. The decline of the eel population in the Thames and the shift in East End demographics through the 1970s and 1980s reduced the eel pie shops from hundreds to fewer than 30, where they remain today as museums of a vanished food culture. Number 16, peas pudding. The peas pudding sold hot in a bag from the pork butcher's shop in the north of England and in Belgium and the Netherlands, a smooth yellow puree of split peas cooked with a ham hock, was the vegetable side dish of the industrial working-class table for 150 years. Spread on bread with cold ham or scooped alongside a pork sausage, peas pudding cost pennies and provided the carbohydrate, protein, and warmth that a factory worker needed. When the pork butcher's shop closed before the supermarket, peas pudding lost its primary retail outlet, and the tradition ended. Number 15. Dripping sandwiches with salt. The beef dripping sandwich, a thick slice of white bread spread with cold dripping from the roasting tin and sprinkled with salt, was the working man's packed lunch, the child's after-school snack, and the late supper of the tired housewife across working-class Britain from the Victorian era through to the 1970s. The dripping was free, a byproduct of the Sunday joint. The bread was cheap, a dripping sandwich cost essentially nothing, and was, in the opinion of everyone who grew up eating them, deeply satisfying in a way that no modern substitute has replicated. When the 1983 NACME report made animal fats a public health enemy and the food industry responded with low-fat spreads presented as healthier alternatives, the dripping sandwich acquired a stigma it has never shed. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. Because the foods described so far were all primarily British, but the next entries describe the vanished foods of continental European working-class tables, dishes that were as central to the daily life of French, German, Belgian, and Dutch households as dripping was to British ones, and that have disappeared with equal thoroughness for similar combinations of changing taste, food industry economics, and the homogenization of the European supermarket shelf. Number 14. Tête de veau and calf's head dishes. The calf's head was one of the most prized ingredients of the French working class and bourgeois table through to the 1960s, served as tête de veau en sauce gribeche at bistros across France, where it was the Thursday lunchtime plat du jour. The dish required skill, patience, and the willingness to work with an ingredient that confronted the cook with exactly what it was. When urban sensibilities began to recoil from ingredients that retained their animal identity, the calf's head disappeared from the bistro menu and the domestic table simultaneously. Number 13. Psalmigen and the German offal tradition. The German working-class table of the post-war decades consumed offal in forms and quantities that would astonish the modern consumer. Psalmigen, a palatinate dish of pig's stomach stuffed with minced pork, vegetables, and spices, was a regional staple famously served by Helmut Kohl to visiting heads of state. Sour lunge, pickled lung in a sour sauce, was a regular feature of the Bavarian butcher's counter. Blutwurst and Leberwurst were daily sandwich fillings as recently as the 1980s. The affluence of the post-war German economic miracle gradually shifted the palate away from cheaper cuts, and the offal tradition retreated toward regional nostalgia. Number 12. Soup à l'oignon as everyday food. Before French onion soup became an international restaurant cliché, it was the everyday restorative food of the French working class, made at Les Halles Market in Paris for the night workers and porters who needed something hot and cheap at 3 in the morning after 8 hours of physical labor. The version eaten by the market workers was coarse, heavily salted, made with lard rather than butter, and covered with a thick layer of stale bread soaked in the broth. It cost almost nothing. It provided everything. When Les Halles was demolished and the market moved to Rungus in 1969, the specific social context that had sustained the authentic version was destroyed. Number 11. Black pudding beyond the breakfast plate. The British black pudding, which retains a presence as a full English breakfast component, was eaten in the 1950s and 1960s far beyond that single context. Sliced and fried as a supper dish, crumbled into stews, or eaten cold in slices with mustard as a sandwich filling, it occupied a broad domestic position. Its French equivalents, the boudin noir of Normandy and the German Blutwurst, occupied similarly broad positions in the domestic kitchen rather than the restricted breakfast context they inhabit today. The squeamishness about blood as a food ingredient that spread through Northern European cultures through the 1970s and 1980s pushed these dishes progressively toward the margins. Second pattern break. This next one is where the most personal memories live. Because the foods described so far were associated with particular ingredients or cooking traditions, but the next entries describe foods so deeply embedded in daily domestic life that for the generation who ate them, tasting them again, or even smelling a kitchen in which they are being prepared, is to be transported entirely back to a childhood kitchen in a specific decade of a specific country in a way that no other sense can achieve. Number 10. Grey peas with bacon in the Netherlands and Belgium. The grey pea, now almost entirely absent from the Dutch and Belgian retail market, was the basis of erwtensoup, the thick Dutch pea soup that was the standard winter meal of the working class for 4 centuries. Made with split gray peas, smoked sausage, celery root, leeks, and ham rind, cooked until the peas had completely dissolved into a thick gray-green mass, this was a food of genuine sustaining power. The traditional test of readiness, that a spoon should stand upright in the pot, indicated a consistency that kept dock workers and factory hands going through a northern European winter. The arrival of canned soup and supermarket varieties made with green split peas gradually displaced the authentic recipe from the domestic kitchen. Number 9. Tripe and onions. Vera Stubbs's Monday dish was the emblem of a whole food culture that sustained the working-class households of Britain, France, and Germany for 150 years. The tripe dresser who prepared the raw stomach lining for retail was a specialized trade that supported dozens of businesses in every industrial city. The Manchester tripe shops that sold it hot from the pot were as common as chip shops in the 1950s. When the appetite for tripe declined in the 1970s, as younger generations rejected their parents' table, the tripe dressers closed one by one, and the infrastructure that had supplied the dish for a century dismantled itself within a decade. Number 8. Potted shrimps from Morecambe Bay. The tiny brown shrimps from Morecambe Bay, boiled on the boats in the early morning and potted the same day in spiced clarified butter in small ceramic jars, were one of the great concentrated flavors of the British food tradition, eaten on hot brown toast at tea time in households along the northwest coast. A jar of Morecambe Bay potted shrimps in the early 1960s cost 1 and 6 and contained enough for 4 rounds of toast. When the shrimp populations declined through overfishing, and when the rail links that had distributed them were reorganized under beaching, the potted shrimp became first a regional specialty and then a premium product sold in delicatessens at prices that removed them from the everyday table. Number 7. Lard-based pastry and lard sandwiches. The lard sandwich, bread spread with pure white rendered pork lard and sprinkled with salt, existed alongside the dripping sandwich as the working-class child snack and the household's emergency food at the end of the week. Lard was the primary cooking fat in the British and Central European kitchen until well into the 1970s. The lard pastry that encased the British pork pie and the sausage roll had a crispness and flavor that vegetable fat pastry has never convincingly replicated. When lard was reclassified as a health risk in the 1980s and the food industry substituted vegetable shortening in commercial products, the authentic lard tradition ended. Number 6. Deviled kidneys on toast. The deviled kidney, a lamb's kidney split and grilled in spiced butter with mustard and Worcestershire sauce and served on toast, was the standard British breakfast of the Victorian upper middle class, and through the first half of the 20th century, it descended the social scale until it was a regular Sunday morning treat in working-class households. In the 1960s, a pound of lamb's kidneys cost 6pence and would provide deviled kidneys for a family of 4. When lamb's kidneys disappeared from the standard butcher's counter as offal fell from fashion, and when the butcher's shop gave way to the supermarket meat counter stocking only prime cuts, deviled kidneys became a lost food that people remembered with specific and slightly incredulous pleasure. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal, because the final entries on this list are not foods that disappeared because the ingredients became unavailable or because the science changed. They are foods that disappeared because a generation decided they did not want to pass them on, and by the time the generation after that began to be curious about what had been lost, the knowledge of how to make them had already gone with the people who had made them every week without writing anything down. Number 5. Egg and chips with bread and butter. The combination of 2 or 3 fried eggs, golden fried chips, 2 slices of white bread and butter, and a mug of strong tea was not merely a meal in the post-war British household. It was a ritual of recovery, the thing you ate when you came in late and cold from a shift, when you were not well enough for a proper dinner, when the housekeeping had run short. It cost almost nothing. It was ready in 12 minutes. It was deeply, specifically comforting in a way that required no sophistication to appreciate. The version eaten today in the cafes that still serve it has lost the specific context of need and recovery that made it what it was. Number 4. Bread and dripping with soup. The hot version of the dripping sandwich, a bowl of vegetable broth with a thick slice of bread spread heavily with hot dripping floating on the surface and melting into the stock, was the working-class first course, and sometimes the entire meal of the economically pressed household from the Victorian era through to the early 1980s. On a winter evening, when the money had run short, the soup bone that had simmered all day and the week's accumulated dripping produced a meal of genuine satisfaction from essentially nothing. The arrival of cheap tinned soup and margarine-spread sliced bread provided a convenient alternative, and the hot bread and dripping soup disappeared without anyone mourning it specifically. Number 3. Bone broth drunk as a beverage. Before bone broth became a health food trend sold in paper cups at $20 a serving, it was simply the liquid left in the pot after the bones had given up their goodness, strained and salted and drunk from a mug as a warming beverage on cold evenings, given to convalescents and children. In French households, it was called bouillon and was considered a restorative of the most fundamental kind. In British working-class households, it was called beef tea. The practice disappeared when the stock cube and the can of soup provided a quicker alternative that required no simmered bones. Number 2. Stoved potatoes with onions and dripping. The Scottish and Northern English dish of potatoes layered with onions and beef dripping in a covered pot and cooked slowly until soft and golden at the bottom, known in Scotland as stovies, was the standard Monday supper of the working-class household from the Victorian era through to the 1970s, made from the leftover dripping and potatoes from the Sunday joint. It required almost nothing: a pot, potatoes, onions, dripping, salt, and an hour of low heat. It produced a dish of extraordinary savory richness from the cheapest possible ingredients. When the leftover dripping from the Sunday joint ceased to be available because the joint gave way to the supermarket chicken breast, stovies lost their primary ingredient and disappeared. Number 1. The Sunday joint and everything that followed from it. At the very top of this list sits not a single dish but the entire food system that the Sunday joint sustained. The joint itself, a piece of beef, lamb, or pork large enough to feed the household for the first meal and then generate the cold meat, the dripping, the bones, the stock, and the leftover vegetables that fed the family for the rest of the week, was the organizing principle of the working-class European food economy from the mid-Victorian era through to the early 1980s. Monday's cold meat with pickle, Tuesday's bubble and squeak with leftover vegetables fried in dripping, Wednesday's shepherd's pie with the minced cold meat, Thursday's soup with the bones, Friday's dripping sandwiches. The Sunday joint was not one dish, it was 5 days of eating planned in advance, executed without waste, and producing results at every stage that were genuinely worth eating. When the supermarket made individual portions of everything available at competitive prices, when the refrigerator and freezer made the 5-day cycle unnecessary, the joint ceased to be the foundation of the household food economy and became instead an occasional treat, stripped of its role as the source of 5 days of sustaining meals from a single piece of meat. These 20 disappeared foods share a quality that the modern food industry has systematically replaced with something that looks similar but functions entirely differently. They were not products purchased in final form. They were ingredients and techniques that the cook transformed into meals, and the transformation was the point. The dripping from the roasting tin was not a waste product. It was the beginning of the next 4 days of cooking. The bones from the joint were not garbage. They were Tuesday's stock and Wednesday's soup. The tripe from the butcher was not a curiosity, it was Monday's dinner and a marker of the cook's competence. What we have lost is not only the flavor of these foods, though the flavor is genuinely lost. What we have lost is the relationship between the cook and the food, the understanding that every part of what the animal offered had a use, that nothing was wasted, and that the skill of the kitchen was measured not in the quality of the best meal produced from the finest ingredients, but in the quality of the daily meals produced from what was left. Your parents and grandparents knew this. They did not know they knew it because it was simply how food worked. And they were right. The knowledge is still here. They knew. Now you know, too.